I think, yeah, you can see my screen now, right?
Great, yeah, so you can see your screen. So welcome everybody to the TIA Centre Seminar Series. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Nikolas from UMC Utrech. Nikolas is the Principal Investigator for AI Development and Implementation at the Pathology Department at UMC Utrech. He has a background in medical image analysis, and he's currently responsible for the development and implementation of digital pathology solutions and for the AI implementation in clinical practice. He's also been a co-organizer for grand challenges such as AMIDA 13, Camellia 16, TUPAC 16, and the MIDOG challenges. And today we're looking forward to your presentation, where I'm sure you're going to give a good overview of all your experience in the field.
Okay, I'll try to do my best. First of all, I'm going to give a little overview of the challenges that we've done, and I'll try to tie that into the next step, which is basically clinical implementation and the AI implementation. Just a small intro into that. We started a couple of years ago. We said, okay, we're not a research group. So our hospital, we're a lab. We do clinical diagnosis, we do pathology diagnosis. So we want to do things in practice, and we try to do some AI applications in practice. And we realized quite quickly that it was actually quite hard. There was a lot of small details which I totally neglected. So I have some of those things that I learned so far in this presentation. So first of all, I want to talk how to develop AI models, and where do they come from. This image was generated with DALL-E. So I just typed in, you see here in the prompt, you see apple tree pathology images. You can get these nice images. I thought some AI generated content for this presentation was most appropriate. So we're first going to talk, how do AI models come into being, right? Now, the most basic stuff is, how do you develop? And that's by having a data set, which you then have to split into 3 parts: training, validation, and test. And you just have to follow some basic rules in order to develop a mostly robust model. So this is quite basic. It's something that a lot of people learn even now, even in bachelor programs, and then using that, you go forward. But it's so for everybody who's into the research field and has read other papers from other groups. They always know how difficult that is sometimes to figure out what has a group done so far, how they've implemented a model, which data set they used, which kind of choices they made, right? So it makes it a little bit complicated sometimes to actually evaluate the work produced by a certain group. So a lot of big groups, and I think your group is actually one of those groups, they're quite open in how they do things. They publish a lot of data and models, and it's very easy to see how things have done. But not everybody does that, of course. Yes. So one way of doing it, one solution would be to either make all code and all data sets open source and open data sets. However, this puts more the burden of proof on the community instead of the authors, right? So then you just make everything open, and then you just ask everybody to figure it out, which is, it's a way to do it, but it's not always the best way to do it. So one thing that we like to do as a group, and I know that Warwick also has a lot of experience in that, is setting up medical image challenges. And that's a way of making sure that your data is available and there's a fair use to it. And however, through imposing certain rules, you make sure that the solutions are applied to the same data and the same criteria, and ideally in a blinded manner. So very briefly, in order to set up a challenge, you first have to define a task, and it's very important that task is very well defined. And usually grand challenges, they might have a list of tasks, 1, 2, 3, and they might be separately evaluated. For that, then you have to curate a data set, you publish that data set, and then you have to publish also a clear procedure. How are the results going to be evaluated? How is a score going to be produced? and on which instances this will be done. You invite researchers and other groups, and most of the times this happens usually during a workshop or during a conference. But of course, 6 is optional, and you can just go through 1 to 5, and that's very often the case, especially with Kaggle, where you can just define a task without actually attaching it to a workshop. Now, our group, together with other partners, we've all run several challenges in the past years, and so I have I'm going to mention a couple here. The first one we organized together with Mitko Veta from Technical University of Eindhoven was MIDOG. That was mitosis detection. Straightforward, the data set with mitosis, and then the groups had to detect the most mitosis, of course. One of the interesting things of this challenge was that was the first time we saw a deep learning application on it. And we found that very interesting, and we kind of got bit by the bug, let's say, back then, which then kind of focuses our research interests for the coming years. After that, we followed up with 2back16, which was a more expanded version of the MIDOG, but also a more novel hypothesis, because instead of just doing the mitosis counting, we tried to link the mitosis counting to the proliferation score based on molecular data. It turned out that that task was actually quite difficult, and most of the researchers were actually interested in mitosis count. So after that, we went back to the basics, and together with a group from Germany and Vienna and Austria, we set up MIDOG 2021. So I'm going to go a little bit more deeply into this challenge, a little bit about the results and how this worked, and a little bit more about this. So for this challenge, we basically try to expand all the other challenges that have been done on mitosis detection, mainly making it a multi-domain challenge. So basically, instead of having all the data set scanned with just one scanner, or maybe 2, have it scanned with 6 different scanners. And not only that, but also make sure that the test set, part of the test set was unseen. That means that for this challenge, for the training set, we scanned 50 slides with 4 different scanners. And then we also had a preliminary test set. And then for the test set, we scanned 20 slides per scanner with 80 in total. The only difference was that the training data set, we used 4 scanners and also 4 scanners of test set. But in the test set, there were also 2 scanners which are unseen. So there were no slides in the data set and training data set scanned with those scanners. That made it quite challenging because that means that you had to test your data set on an unseen scanner. So we produced a training set which had 1,700 approximately MIDOG figures, and we also introduced the concept of hard examples. Well, not the concept, but just hard examples. So mitotic figures which look like, non-mitotic figures which look like mitosis, but they're not, they're negative. And that also could help. So groups could use that as a sort of like a hard example mining. So for the results, we had several teams, and we set up a cutoff point that above that point we will accept the submissions for the final results. But I think these are all the F1 scores that we got. And as you can see, and you see here also TS Center, basically your group took the first place. So you share this first place with this group with very original actually applications. So what was very interesting about this challenge was the way that, of course, the process was proposed. I see somebody's raising his hands, and that is from the center. Sure.
I'm just going to fill the questions as they come in on the chat.
Sure, go for it.
So Dang asked about the domain shift. He said, so domain shift due to scanners versus domain shift due to sensor, i.e. protocol, which one is more challenging in current practice?
It's a good question. So for this, let me see. Do I have the slides here? Let me see. just look forward. No, I'll go backwards. So it's a good question. So for example, for the test sets, we had basically 3 Hamamatsu scanners. So the same vendor, but then 3 different models. So they have also a different little bit sensor. At the same time, you also have from the other vendor. So there's completely different, let's say, also type of like sensor, but also completely domain. So for this challenge, we had slides from one type of cancer. So that was breast cancer, but then 6 scanners. If you just go a little bit forward. Okay. So these are the results across the scanners per group. Yeah. Which means, and then here you can basically see, for example, blue is the Hamamatsu XR. And then you see that all groups basically had really good performance with that scanner. But if you would go back and take a look at the Leica, then you see that performance there was a gap there, right? So there was a big difference. And of course, you introduce a third scanner, and then you see exactly what the results are. So you see from this graph here, you can basically kind of pinpoint which group has performed better. So basically, the groups that performed, let's say, had the highest score were also the groups that had less distance between those distributions. So you see, for example, it's a little bit shifted here, but the last one is the AI medical, and the one for that, this is you guys. So you see like the difference between distributions is much lower compared to example, this group or this group or this group. So what exactly contributes most to the domain shift? I think, of course, it's really scanner dependent, of course, but this is a good indication to see how that contributes, basically. I don't know if that helps, if that answers the question.
Yeah, that massively helps. So just to really try and understand the difference between center and scanner here. So was the test set replicated across the different scanner types? How did that work? So you show the different distributions here corresponding to the different results. I guess the distribution would be a combination of center and scanner here, would it?
So every center, so this is like, so this line is just center, right?
Yeah.
So for example, this is AI medical. Every distribution here is then a separate scanner.
Right.
So these are all this is the score of that particular scanner. And in red, this is Hamamatsu RS, for example. And this is Leica. So then, I mean, you see basically that, for example, Hamamatsu RS, if you see like, check out across every center, they all score a little lower, right? They have a very big also spread. But you see that, for example, these 2 last groups, like the mean is of course shifted a little bit more to the right. So they have a better performance, right? It's still quite spread. And then you see, so here you can like really, really well see that, yeah, the RS is kind of problematic. Like it's a little bit all over the place, the performance, right?
Do you have any intuition why that is?
So the RS, the RS specifically is a little bit weird scanner. It's not a LED light, it's halogen. So very well be that, I don't know, like the first slide of a scanner was very different than the last one. It's very possible. I wouldn't be able to say. However, like I have a slide here. Let me see if I can find it. Did I delete it? You know what? I'll just jump into our slides. These are not the Nikkei. Let me just show here. I have an example here. This is I'll unhide it. Let's show this one. So this is a slide, same slide, 3 scanners, right? Hamamatsu, all 3. The problem is like through Zoom, sometimes it's a little bit tricky to see the differences. But you know, scanner 1 is like XR, no, RS, the other one is XR, the other one is the S360. And I always find it like fascinating that the same vendor can produce like 3 different like slides. Especially you see also like it's very difficult to see, I think, over Zoom, but especially the background, the one scanner has completely, let's say like white, and the other one has like, you know, noise. It's fascinating. I wouldn't be able to comment like why exactly like scanner produces much more variable performance. However, for the data set that we were using, not all scanners were annotated, so that also contributed to the thing. So you had to also, for example, the Leica, we didn't have any annotations, so you can only use the Leica just for the image, but not with specific annotations. This is, wait, this is the results. Yeah, exactly. And this is basically seen versus unseen. So yeah, scanners which were present in the training set, scanners which were not present in the training set. And again, you see basically the high performing teams were the teams where that performance was of course closer to each other. That means that what they did was much more generalizable and much more yeah, it was actually much more generalizable, right? The way it was not so sensitive to domain shift. So for the challenge, we also developed a reference model, Frauke Wilm, from the group of Mark Oberville. She made a model which was used as a guidance for the participants. So participants that had no experience, then they could see a little bit how you could develop a model for mitosis detection and how to do also a little bit the domain discrimination. Now, Frauke did not just do the task of like making a reference or some sort of model as a guidance. She actually produced a model that had a very good performance, which was a problem in the beginning because a lot of the submissions were actually performing less than a reference. So this actually really good. It's quite simple, let's say. It wasn't really, let's say, exotic, and it actually performed quite well. So I had a 0.79 to the F1 to the test sets. And I'll come back to that model later on. This shows a little bit the generalization of the features based on different techniques. So by using, for example, normalization or augmentation, or not using that, for example, that would produce, of course, different types of features. So for a model that doesn't use any augmentation or normalization, you see like the feature produces like a very clear clusters of the different domains, and that leads to very poor generalization. Whereas the reference approach, which was they used a very online augmentation normalization, you see a very uniform spread in the feature space. So this was also very interesting to see how that how those features can generalize across different domains. So grand challenges can stimulate the production of really nice models. I mean, it's very interesting to see how things how people approach problems when they have a time pressure, because grand challenges have a very specific deadline and a very defined task. So then the question is then, because a lot of things stop there. Now, for me personally, I find the next step of that more interesting, and that is, okay, how do we take a model and how do we, let's say, use it or put it into production? So I'm gonna make a small detour and give a little bit of introduction of our hospital and our lab, and what have we been doing in the past couple of years. So first of all, we started in 2007 with the implementation of digital pathology. Back then was mostly research and education, but we did not do primary diagnostics because that was, of course, back then with the scanner that we had, took too much time and the workflow was not really efficient. However, in 2016, we switched to a fully digital primary diagnostics workflow. And at the moment, we have a daily production of 1,200 slides, I'd say, approximately. And our infrastructure can, say, handle 150 slides per hour successfully. So we have now around 6 scanners full-time that work for our lab. And of course, we can do the res, stack, cytology, and we also for some of our images we also use we have also DICOM, but that's not standard. And of course, we do home mounts. So this is actually a older picture because now we have the newest S360 scanner from Watson. So this is actually an older picture, which shows a little bit how our scanner room. So we have one room with all the scanners in them, and as soon as the slide is done from the lab, it then goes to the scanner room, gets scanned, and it gets imported into our PACS system, which is then available for our pathologist. And the PACS system has work lists, so this way a pathologist knows exactly which cases for them. And of course, we scan everything 40x. So for something that's 15 by 15, you'll get a resolution of 65,000 by 65,000 pixels, which are quite big. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you know about that. This is just like a minor tidbit. When we were implementing digital pathology, like at the beginning of 2016, we were coming across a couple of quality issue problems. So the slides did not look that very nice. And so one approach that we did is we start cutting everything a little bit thinner. So this shows a slide cut of 4 micrometers and a slide next to it is 3 micrometers. And then you see basically that the contrast increases quite nicely with that. So in order to get that into practice, we had to do a lot of like all these small steps in order to make sure that we have nice, good quality images slides and good enough basically for diagnostic purposes. And of course, once you scan the images, you can make nice annotations, you can produce nice reports. I see a hand, so someone has a question. Please go ahead.
Quick question, Nicholas. So you're mentioning about cutting with different thicknesses there. Is there a guideline for how thick hospitals typically would cut their sections out?
I don't think there's like a universal guideline. In general, depending on the protocols, you have different thicknesses. So for example, kidney biopsies with specific, with Jones, they do like 1 micrometer. But from practice, I know that every lab has kind of like their own guideline. I think 3 micrometers could be quite standard now, maybe even 2. So before that, for us, it was kind of like random. We had like between 3 and 5, and with the optical microscope, it's quite easy, let's say, to go through the slide. So it didn't really matter that much, to say. So this just became like a very urgent, let's say, issue once we went digital, because then you just get 1 plane, and then it's the contrast, and then you see that the contrast is quite different, right? So if you don't want to go to like a fully Z-stack workflow, which is quite costly and time consuming, then this is one of the, say, middle, or one of the tricks that say you can apply, cut everything thinner. I think historically, like the better that tools become, the more thinner you can cut, basically, right?
Right, thanks.
So yes, the slide I showed before. Again, I'm not sure if you can see the difference through the Zoom meeting, but trust me, there's a difference, and it's very, very. I mean, doing things like in practice, applying digital pathology in practice, it's quite hard. I mean, in a sense that comparing that to radiology, you don't replace equipment, you add to it. So you basically increase the complexity of a lab. And that can incur high costs. So a lot of smaller labs do not opt to do things, of course, digitally, because it just adds to the cost without adding too much to the workflow. So for us, I think we managed to, optimize our workflow using digital pathology. So, and also has a lot of like benefits in that sense. And this is a controversial, I think, statement here. The optical resolution microscope is higher, but I think any pathologist can attest to that. That basically, yeah, you can beat the optical microscope. It's much better, right? Also the feeling and everything. But you can do easy and accurate measurements. And my personal favorite use case, or what I've seen from applying digital pathology in practice, is preparing for multidisciplinary meetings. So if you want to do this with slides, it can take hours, but doing it digitally, it takes minutes. So if you are a center like ours, which is an academic center, and we have 35 to 40 MDMs per week, right? If you add those hours up per person that you have to prepare for those, that's a lot of hours, let's say, wasted just to prepare for meetings. And of course, other things which are known to people too when you use digital pathology. So after having a digital infrastructure, the very next step, I think, is AI application, right? It's the next logical step, and it's that the one we've always strived as a department. So we always said, we go digital, we get that up and running, and then we start focusing on the AI application, and that's where you actually start getting the the benefits, right? So there's an extrinsic motivation for that, and by extrinsic I mean basically things which happen outside of a span of our control. So as I think every lab has seen, experiences this, the increasing volume examination, which goes, increasing volume is not per se a problem if the budget, let's say, follows it, right? But that's not the case. Usually the amount of volumes, the volume of examinations that that happens is disproportionate to the budget, right? Of course, you want to make sure you improve patient outcomes. You want to make sure that despite the more work that you have to do as a lab, you want to make sure that the outcomes of patients is, of course, better. And there's always a pressure either from, I don't know, NHS in your case, and from insurances in our case, to lower costs, right? You have to do more with less, basically. But I mean, as a lab, and since we're also an academic lab, we have some intrinsic motivation. Why would we want to do this, of course, right? And one thing is, and there's something very common that pathologists, of course, say, they want to, all these small repetitive tasks, they want to make them, they want to automate them. We want to make sure, that the specialist is focused on the task and not doing many other tasks, which would take, that steals time, that robs time, but also robs attention from the specialist. And we want to make sure we have some method to either triage cases or maybe do extra readings. So these are some very good AI in its application. So how does then the model go into clinical practice, right? So we first, of course, start with the model development. That's something I described in a previous thing with the challenges. That's one way to getting a model. You then, of course, have to validate the model, and even if you have a test set and you test it, you of course have to put it into production and start testing it with newer test sets or even external test sets. You have to optimize. You might have to change the architecture to better to make it more generic, let's say. And then it comes into production, deployment. And there's several ways to do deployment, and we're not talking, because if you have a model, it's impossible to take completely directly to production. You have to do apart from the pilots you have to do, you might have to do some A/B testing, or to do some shadow deployment, which is interesting. So shadow deployment is basically applying the AI in practice, but telling nobody about it and just following what the pathologist does. So if you have a model that let's say predicts what type of skin cancer there is, then you basically have it follow the pathologist and see if it agrees or not. And once you have that in production, you have to do, of course, monitoring. You have to maybe update the model with new examples. Some applications might also require active learning. But after a while, once you have the model in production, you might start noticing a model shift. So the model starts having, like, say, worse performance, and that's kind of like a noticeable effect, which happens with model production. That means that you might have to go back and start the whole process again. So it's not models are not static in that sense. You have to have a system in place to make sure that you can go through that feedback cycle. So everybody who's done, let's see, some product development or has developed anything knows that every decision you make when you develop some technical product will incur some technical debt. Every choice you make, you're going to feel it down the road, right? If you do the wrong choice of a certain framework, you'll basically see it. That means that every choice you make at every step, be that, okay, how am I going to, let's say, do the analysis? Am I going to do it on the cloud, on a high performance cluster, on premise, or on a workstation under my desk? That's going to have some impact. What kind of code repository I'm going to use? Am I going to use a code repository? Am I going to do a model registry? Am I going to keep a track of all the experiments I've done and be able to find the training data that I used 2 years ago for that model? These are, of course, very important. Let's say I have a model which I found from somewhere on the internet, on GitHub, and I downloaded it, and it works quite fine. and then I apply it, and then a year later it doesn't work that well, would I be able to retrain it? I mean, that's not, it's going to be almost impossible. And of course, in clinical practice, all these matter, but they don't matter that much. What matters is how well is a system integrated in the existing system. You don't want to be making new systems which add to the original, to the complexity of the lab. This is a really like a really nice picture figure I found from a paper. The paper is cited here. I can also send it around, which basically shows the proportionality of the effort needed per subsystem, right? So here in the middle in black is the machine learning coder, right? And it's only a small fraction of all the rest that you need to do, right? This is the amount of effort. So basically, developing a model might be the least amount of work you have to do. Like the data collection, and this is a little more up to date it's a similar figure, but you know, data extraction, labeling, verification, all of that, version control, all of that is only a fraction for compared to the machine learning code. It creates a sort of iceberg, right? So what you feel, what you see on top, and what you actually have to arrange below. So for pathologists, you know, we want to have you know, more reproducibility. We want to have a quantitative diagnosis. We want to support a specialist, improve turnaround time, and you want to do that. And you want to show some stuff also on the screen, and you want to do it in a specific way. Then every other design choice, software, framework you choose will affect that. And it's and especially in the AI field, the choices are now immense. How to do that? Oh, sorry, that's oh, I went back to it. So I'm gonna explain a couple of types of implementations, and then I'm gonna also give an example of the implementation that we're working on here at UMC. So first of all, a model in practice is a model that works as automatically as possible, right? So you want to have some sort of triggering mechanism. So ideally, the model or some system, you know, checks everything that comes inside, and then it checks based on some predefined criteria if that model can be applied. In case that it can do, you know, you apply the model on that case, and then you can return the results on the sides as annotation, right? For example, tumor area. I want to detect tumor on a specific slide. But you also have another type of implementation, and that is, so you have, like, for example, like a tumor segmentation tool will give you some sort of information which you then apply to form your diagnosis. But not all tools have to be that kind of type of tools. Some tools can do triage, right? So they take a look at the side, and they determine if the risk, or if it's a high risk case or not. And depending on that, they can then reroute the case to the correct person. So for example, you can say, well, this is a high risk case. I'll send it to the specialist directly. This way we're increasing turnaround time, and we make sure that the specialist gets to see only the difficult cases or not, right? So I'm gonna show a little bit a model that we have now. We're in the process of validating in our production system. So this is a model that can detect mitotic cells in breast tissue. And that means that a pathologist can select an area, and then you get to see if there are mitosis in that area. So how that works is that our PAC system will send a image notification to a system. And by image notification, what I mean is that as soon as the slide is imported, there's an automatic trigger that says that sends an image notification to us, to our server, to our A manager server. So then that AI manager server gets that message and then determines if it needs to do something or not. And if it's a breast cancer case, biopsy or resection, then it starts triggering the process of analyzing. So we then download data, and we then send that as a job to a high performance cluster. Now, because we are a research institute, we also have a research network, and actually all of our good stuff and good hardware is on that side. So that means that we have to have this awkward conversation between the clinical network and the research network where we have to send the data over in order to get it analyzed. As soon as the slide is analyzed, we get back the results, and then those results are parsed and are sent back to the PACS. So basically, we can do this automatically. That means that the pathologist then opens the slide and he sees the results, or he can select an area and get the results only for that area. But we also have the option to do that manually. So if the slide is not analyzed for some reason, you can just select it, and then after a while it gets analyzed. So the goal of this model is to have everything analyzed within 15 minutes. So as soon as the slide comes in, and 15 minutes later, it has to have results for the pathologist. So that when the pathologist opens the case, so before it starts reading the case, we already have the slides analyzed. So we've done some performance testing so far, and we managed to have, say, 25 slides in approximately 30 minutes, which is within the goals that we defined. So I'm going to show a small video. Oh wait, sorry, I think somebody raised a hand. Let's do that first.
Yeah, just before you before you show the video. So just a question regarding the deployment of this system. So is it in clinical trials stage, or are you developing it so you can roll it out to various different institutions?
We're going to get into that. But the thing is, we are in the process of a validation, of an internal validation.
Right.
Basically taking the model from idea into clinical practice. But that process is only for our hospital. We can't take that validation and apply it to another hospital. That will require that we have to apply it as let's say, get an IVDR certification or a medical device. And that's way above our pay grade, let's put it this way.
Right.
So the easiest thing to do in that case, if you have something that works and works quite well, I think it's to give it to a company and then they take it further, let's say, right? So we are going to do, let's say, the whole process, but this is something that we will only be able to use in our hospital. But it's going to be certified, but then within our center. If you want to do a multi-center thing, it's complicated. I'll learn how this works. Quality is okay. So basically on the left side, yeah, so these are already the annotations generated. So the system has the option of generating annotations with the highest density of mitosis. So it shows the top 3 areas where the most mitosis are found. Oh, it's a little bit cut off. On the left side, you see basically 2 groups of mitosis. And yeah, you don't see it. Sorry about that. The top one is the mitosis, and the below that is negative. So you see on the screen, you see there's 2 classes, mitosis negative. So what we do with a model is we have 2 thresholds. So you have the detection threshold, which is defined. So that's the one how we what we calculate when we want to get the F1 score, right? So everything that the model finds above that threshold shows up as mitosis, and everything below that but above another threshold, and that's usually we use in this case the F2 score, or this or some sort of threshold of sensitivity, becomes a lower threshold. So everything that falls between those 2 thresholds is then classified as negative. However, when you see the results, it's very easy to switch between classes. So it gives the pathologist an overview of everything classified already, but you can very easily go from one class to the other. This way you can very easily view the areas and then correct or not. So in this example, we have let's say the top 3 areas. You can just do, of course, top 1 or top 5, it doesn't matter. Or you can do a very your own custom, let's say, area. So you can say, well, I want to see all the mitosis in the tumor. I want to see the mitosis in this area. Because the slide is pre-analyzed, the results are in the database already, so you get the answer back immediately. Right. So then another pilot that we are trying to do now, and this is more about infrastructure. Oh yes, somebody's raising hands, please.
So a question online. So the question asks how long, so you've reported some times on how long it takes to process a region or a slide.
Right.
So how long is that time for a given region or the entire whole slide image?
Right, good question. Okay, so first of all, what I forgot to mention is which model we're using. And in this case, we're using the reference model from MIDOG. So it's a RetinaNet. And that model, it's actually quite fast. And on a single GPU, we can do a whole slide in around 5 minutes, 5, maybe 10 minutes max, right? Which is within that constraint that we said in the beginning that we want having everything analyzed in 15 minutes. But because this is a job-based system, there might be some delays. So, you know, even if it's 5 minutes, it might take up to 10 minutes, I think, to have the results back.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
I see.
As well.
Yeah.
Can you hear me, Nikolas?
Yeah, but a little bit in like in far end. Or not at all now.
Okay.
That's better.
Great presentation. Should I go?
Oh yeah, I got a compliment already, so that's nice.
So must have been in the same room, so there's a bit of
interference with the I thought he just wanted to compliment me. Yeah, that's it. No question needed.
I really like this demo, so just want to clear up for myself. So you said that this tool brings some candidates in some region of interest. What the first thing that the image is uploaded to the tax system, right? It means that automatically detects the hotspot regions for the pathologist to review them, right?
Yes.
But what I got from the demo was that it seems that some ROIs have been already specified, the whole slide image. Is that correct? Or?
That is correct. So so it's still like the system's a little bit still in development. So some things we can trigger, something we can't. So you see that I kind of like deleted an area. So basically how this works now in practice, because I have it in the production system, it's just that our pathologists don't know about it. Basically how it works is this. Let's say a slide is analyzed already. And basically you can like draw a region of interest and then you get the mitosis in that region of interest. Then we have a small button that you can press, which then generates the top three areas. And then you can like view those areas. But these are purely design choices that we made so far because we want to run a study and we want to make sure that the top 3 areas are not immediately visible. We want them to be able to do something first before they get them.
Yeah, totally.
We could very easily have this run and then automatically send back, let's say, the top area where the mitosis is. And that might be like the best thing for the pathologist, like in clinical practice. These are also things we want to evaluate in practice, like want to see like what's better for the pathologist. What do you want to do?
Yeah, sure. So just quick question. Do you do mitosis at 40x magnification or 20x?
40x.
Cool, thanks.
40x. Yeah, so and also like about that. So there's a lot of, let's say, design choices we made so far, and these might change in a moment, but there's some options to do. Also, the region of interest that we present are circles, and that's because we try to do a more complicated polygon and it became computationally quite complicated, so we stopped working on that at the moment. We're going to pick that up, I think, later, but for now it's just circles. This is another pilot that we're running, and this is about infrastructure. And the idea is that basically, our hospital has a cluster for people to use when they log in. They get a virtual session, and this cluster has GPUs. So we're trying to figure out now a way to use that, but then during the night to do AI analysis. So the idea is like after 6 o'clock, where the use of the system goes down to 10%. You switch the nodes over to compute mode, right? And then you basically start up and you set up like a system where you can run AI. So this is something that can be also used for diagnostics, but also for research, because then you'll have like a research GPU, high performance cluster in the same environment where the diagnostic data is. So it will make much easier access to that data, let's say. And we're using Ray for that. It's called Ray Serve. And it's basically a system where you can do model serving. So it's very easy to scale up and have a system where you can have a model that runs as a web service. So you can very easily set up VMs that can run this system. So as I mentioned, we are in the process of doing the validation, right? This is a 4-stage process. I couldn't find the image, but it's a sort of like a funnel. You start with the idea and you start like, going into the next stage. And the idea is that like not all ideas can become, let's say, products. However, for this one, we know there's like a very robust use case and business case. So we're taking it directly to stage 4. But the idea is like you first start with a sort of feasibility study, see if this is going to work. After that, you start preparing for the study. You do the data set registration. You do everything needed to in order to get the model up and running. And then you go through pilots. And in the meantime, you start noting down, of course, all the quality parameters and all the criteria, acceptance criteria for the stage. And then you do the clinical and practical validation. Another question.
Yeah, so you're doing all this validation. Did you find that all the data that you collected as part of the challenges was enough, or did you have to go in and collect more annotations and optimize the model further?
So, so when we first started this process, we had a different model, which was from challenges. The data was from challenges, but we had to actually go inside and do some like retraining, especially a lot of artifacts, let's say ink, that kind of stuff. So you have to, give a lot of, let's say, negative examples to make sure that it doesn't pick up like random things. When we did the MIDOG, because a lot of the data came from our hospital, and we also use those scanners there, we found that, for example, the reference model, it generalized quite well. So the performance, it was on par with that previous model, maybe even better in some cases. So now we're just using the reference model, and it's sort of like a placeholder in the sense that this validation process, it's not per se just for the model, the validation is for the whole system. So during this process, we want to have during this, let's say, validation process, we want to make a process where we can more rapidly evaluate new models when needed and get them into production. So we don't want to make a validation of the retinal innate. We want to make a validation of the mitotic detector. And the model at the moment is the retinal innate, for example.
Makes sense. We've got one more question as well from Sarah online, asking for your application that you demonstrated. Is there a reimbursement code that can be leveraged once the clinical validation is complete?
A reimbursement code?
Yeah, so I don't know whether you want to speak up and ask that question yourself.
I assume if I can charge somebody to pay me to use this.
Yeah, so for example, like for immunohistochemistry slides, we have reimbursement codes from insurances. CPT code is at least in US. For your specific application for H&E, is there some already established computer-aided quantification insurance code that you guys want to leverage at this point in time, or that's
no, not yet. Unfortunately, nobody's so nice to pay us to use AI. We have to pay out of money. So the idea is, so all of our business cases that we're trying to make some business cases, some use cases, and to see how we can do this in practice. We are an academic hospital, so that gives us, we can get funding for research and say implementation. The idea is to see if we can basically, first of all, fund like the implementation through other funds, and then after that, make sure that like the AI we use saves either time or saves immunohistochemistry or does have some business, let's say, value in that sense. At the moment, we can't do that. However, there are some companies working on AI solutions which do some sort of prediction, right? So you might have a model that does sort of outcome prediction. You could argue that's some sort of test, either like it's not a molecular test, but it's like similar to a molecular test. You could then maybe charge for that. But at the moment, there's no, at least in the Netherlands, there's no, like, I haven't seen any codes. I talked to our finance people. We don't have anything like that yet.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So basically, that was a little bit more or less what I wanted to say. So I think the most important thing is, from my experience so far, is that the implementation part of AI is actually quite complicated. It has a lot of moving parts, a lot of people. So I think it's going to be like practically what's going to happen in the future is that there's going to be a lot of, let's say, examples of centers having some implementations, but I think the bulk of the implementation is going to fall on the private sector and on companies to do that productization necessary and support. It just gets really quite quickly quite complicated. So we like doing current challenges, and we find it's a great way to generate insights, produce new models, stimulate that development, and also gives us some ideas there. So this year we have a new MIDOG challenge. So it's going to be a continuing of the old one, and it's going to be more slides, and we're also going to have actual dogs, as in tissue. So we're going to have tissue from dogs and cats, as well as other types except breast cancer. So the idea is to, out of this challenge, to get a universal mitosis detector, basically one model to detect mitosis regardless of tissue. So we'll see how that goes. The challenge is open at the moment, and it's going to be in the context of MICAI 2022 in September in Singapore. So if you haven't registered yet, then you want to register, it's still open. So yeah, I think that was about it. Any more questions?
Great, thanks, Nikolas. Brilliant presentation. So I've got a bunch of questions, and we've got some in the room as well. I think we can start with Rob.
Perfect.
Hi, thanks for the talk, Nikolas. Very interesting. A couple of questions. Under production, you listed monitoring, active learning, and model updates. Can you explain what sort of protocol you imagine would be appropriate for monitoring?
For monitoring, yeah. So you have two types of monitoring. One is monitoring the system itself, right? Making sure that it functions. And the other one is monitoring the performance. So what you want to do is, so for example, in the mitosis, one way of monitoring the performance is basically once you present the results to the pathologist, you then keep a track of the delta. So every time the pathologist changes the classification, keep track of that. My model said this is mitosis, pathologist disagreed. And if you then keep track of that, and that becomes, let's say, higher and higher over time, then you start seeing that there's a shift, there's a model shift. We don't have that in practice yet. We're still building the tools to do that, let's say. But that's one way to do it, basically. How often does a pathologist agree with what the model says?
Okay, if I just respond to that, so you assume that the pathologist can act as an independent decision maker, won't be influenced by whatever the system decides is the result of its analysis.
Yeah. So the system at the moment is just a suggestion. The system says this is what I think. We don't want to make the pathologist to adhere to that necessarily. We just want to give them the option to make it for them easier to review the results. But of course, if they don't agree, they can of course agree, because the pathologist at the end is the one who's responsible for the report. You can very easily have a system that just shows you like all of the cells in an area, and then you just have to apply the label to it. This will take more time. Whereas this system already have something filled in for you. If it's good enough, you don't have to do a lot of movements. If it's not good enough, then you still have to do a lot of changes.
If I just may ask a second question. So you talked about the technical infrastructure to support the application of AI in pathology. What about the human infrastructure? What changes do you imagine would be necessary in order to ensure that the right skills are in place to support the overall process?
That's a very good question, actually. So for academic hospital, we have a pool of people working on these projects, including me and several of my colleagues. So we can do, of course, the support. Not every lab has that resources, right? And that's why I said that you'll probably have to rely a lot on the private sector into getting this support. So you'll have AI companies that will, provide a specific, say, AI model. They will then be responsible about that. After that, you will also need support from, of course, the IT department to support, to provide all the necessary resources and infrastructure for that. And again, that's also quite complicated at the end. I think from what I've seen so far is that every hospital that, let's say, becomes digital, like every lab, they always have like some sort of team of people that are, let's say, the digital pathology specialists. It usually comprises, if not from people from IT department, there'd probably be like a pathologist plus some people from the lab that become a little bit super users, and they become, let's say, the contact persons for the implementation. I think, especially for AI, what will happen is that you'll probably have pathologists being responsible per model, right? So if you have, let's say, a mitosis model in production, you probably have a pathologist who's going to be, let's say, responsible for that model, not for the support and everything, but to, be able to manage that, let's say. I'm not entirely sure how this is going to play out, to be honest. Again, I think it's complicated. It's going to probably require more people at the end. So the idea is to make things easier, of course, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
So, Nikolas, you mentioned a few times how you're doing this validation, and then the companies are going to be the ones to take that technology that you've developed and commercialize that. So, does that mean that you work closely with a spin-out company, or are you getting it to a stage where you then will release the API under a license for different companies to use?
So for our lab, we are already working with companies for different algorithms. I haven't put that in a presentation yet, in a sense, because we don't have anything to show yet. We're still in a rollout phase, let's say. So basically, we are in talks, and we have the several systems already, let's say, in production. And then the idea is, so practically speaking, let's say that that me and my colleagues, we don't work here anymore, and we have this mitosis thing going on, this mitosis model. I think practically what we do, we would probably give this model to one of the companies, have it into their system, and using their, let's say, APIs and everything to implement it into production. So find a way basically to include it into that infrastructure. Or if you have a dedicated infrastructure of your own, and then all the other AI, let's say, models plug into it, then also have that, let's say, plug into that. At some point, there has to be some sort of consolidation and some sort of like very clear management layer to do this.
So I'm going to ask a question that came in earlier on. It was about the results from MIDOG. So Dan, he obviously saw the results and saw that there's differences in the results with the different scanner manufacturers, for example. So Dan is asking, how, after what you've learned from this challenge, what do the results mean in terms of clinical deployment? Do you think that these models are potentially good enough to be used in clinical practice after what you've seen with the difference in the performance across the different scanners?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I think that's exactly it. They're good enough. Like these models are good enough for production at the moment. As I said, like we're using the reference model, and that's good enough for what we do. I think at the end, like, it really depends on how you implement something. So if you have a model that, as the one I showed, that suggests some output, it has to be good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be good enough, right? I think the difference would be, especially in the long term, is that you will be able to have, let's say, more universal models. So if you have the MIDOG data set, especially the new one for the new challenge, it will be very possible to develop like one model that would pretty much work in multiple centers and from multiple scanners. So yeah, I think that's the thing.
Great. Mustafa?
Yeah, thank you again, Nicholas, for the great talk. So with some of these data sets, I appreciate how MIDOG 2021 data set is being meshed into a bigger and more multi-sensory data set in MIDOG 2022. However, because that would enable us to test new algorithms on the same data or better data. However, you have put together great data for 2-pack challenge, right? But the thing is, which in my opinion, it's a unique data set. It has so many mitotic figures annotated in 2-pack data, which are purely annotated by pathologists in comparison to MIDOG data set, which is AI-assisted annotated, if I'm not wrong. But the access to the external test set of 2-pack is no longer exists. I mean, to be more frank about this, I've developed a model which I would like to test on the external set of 2-pack mitosis data set. I have the images, but I don't have the ground truths. I was wondering if that's possible. So I know that there was some plans to move that to grand challenge, but I don't see anything that area being done with MIDOG in the way. But it's a shame to just leave 2-pack data set behind. So is there any plan to be able to test our results on 2-pack?
There is plan. Yeah, we were working on the transferring it to Grand Challenge actually. So I think it's just purely like workload that we haven't done it yet, to be honest. We were still doing like the manual evaluation up until some time ago. So yeah, I think like we haven't. It's still in a backlog. Let's put it this way. But you're absolutely right. It's kind of shame like having these data sets and not having them available somewhere. And in any case, like yeah, I mean, if we're not gonna do anything, might as well just make them open completely, and people can download and do whatever they want with them, right? Like not keep them hidden anymore. I will definitely take that up with my colleague Mitko to speed things up. So for the MIDOG 1, the one from last year, we are now working indeed on making the test set more accessible, as in like people can be submitting more often, or we might actually make it open. We'll see. We haven't decided yet. It's still in the plans. That was actually one of the comments we got from one of the reviewers for the paper, that the test set is not available. They're completely right. We are working on it. We're not gonna sit on the data set. Let's put it this way.
Right, I think well over time, so I think we can wrap things up there. So thank you so much, Nikolas, for joining us today and giving that brilliant presentation. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to listen to your work, and hopefully see you at some point in the future.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.